Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher. Welcome to Sweetwater SoundCheck. This time out, an audio interface and DSP server from Waves. Let's get started. This is the Waves DiGiGrid IOS, an audio interface that also combines DSP power for running Waves plugins. It takes the load off your computer, provides latency-free monitoring, gives you microphone preamps, analog inputs and outputs, digital connectivity, all sorts of things going on in this 2-rack space unit. The DiGiGrid iOS connects to your computer using Ethernet. Now, this is a simple connection, just a single cable. This also allows you to expand your system. You can add more inputs, more outputs, different types of connectivity using the various members of the DiGiGrid family. And again, they all connect using Ethernet, so it's very simple to hook them up. The DiGiGrid iOS features 8 analog inputs. Those can be line, instrument, or mic level. It also has 8 analog outputs, and it has stereo digital ins and outs. On the front panel, we have 2 headphone connections, and those are independently addressable, and each does have its own master volume control. Beyond the inputs and outputs, a great feature of the iOS is that it gives you DSP power for running Waves plugins. Now, this takes the load off your computer. The plugins actually run right inside the chassis. So you can run those plugins when you're recording and not have any latency hit. You can be tracking through a reverb, through a delay, through an EQ, a compressor, and you don't have any latency problems with that. You can also still run plugins inside your computer, and in fact, when you're mixing down inside your DAW, you could be running plugins using that DSP power in the chassis to expand what you have available to you. Let's take a look at how all of this works. SoundGrid Studio is an app that installs into your computer, and it provides you with a number of different functions. First of all, it gives you latency-free monitoring. You can create multiple mixes, you can route those to headphones for your performers, you can create a studio monitor mix, and none of that has any kind of a latency hit with it, even if you're running plugins inside the SoundGrid Studio app. In addition to that, the SoundGrid Studio app allows you to route signals into your DAW so you can track things there, and to route signals back out so that you can monitor what's happening inside your DAW when you're overdubbing. You have a very flexible patching scheme available to you, so you can route any input to any output, and again, you have those headphone outputs as well, so you can set up monitor mixes there. To demonstrate how the iOS and the SoundGrid Studio system works, I put together a session here in my office. We've got Nick DiVirgilio playing percussion, Don Carr is playing bass, and later he'll be laying down some guitar tracks for us as well. We'll be tracking through the DiGiGrid iOS into Studio One from PreSonus. So let's take a look at the SoundGrid Studio app. The way this is set up is we have 4 different layers. The first layer gives us control over the preamps. So in this case, I've got 48-volt phantom power turned on, and that's powering a Neumann U47 FET reissue. We're using that in the front of the cajon that Nick is playing. The second channel is using a Shure dynamic bass drum mic. That's on the back of the cajon. And the third is a direct input from Don Carr's bass. Now we can set the gain here. We have 48-volt phantom power. We can reverse polarity. There's a digital trim if you need to trim the signal down that's flowing into your DAW. And then we can create our master mix down here at the bottom. We've got faders, pans, solo, mute. All those feed the main outs here on the far right. And those are routed to my outputs 1 and 2 on the back of the iOS. Those are feeding my studio monitors. Now all of this is feeding what's called the Emotion ST mixer, and that's what allows us to create this latency-free monitoring system. Headphone 1 is feeding out to Nick, and headphone 2 is feeding to Don. They each have their own independent mixes. I'll show you how we set those up in just a second. Our second layer is the rack, and the rack is where we can insert real-time plugins that we can use while we're tracking. In this case, I'm not using any compression or any EQ, but if I was, I could simply insert that onto a track, open this up. Our plugin list and all of my Waves plugins are available here, and I can insert whichever ones that I want to use. Now in this case, what I did want to have is some reverb for the guys so they have a little bit of ambience when they're tracking inside their headphones. So I've got TrueVerb inserted here on an effects send. That's coming up inside my main outs, which feed to my speakers, and it's also coming up inside the 2 headphone feeds. Our third layer is the routing layer, and this is where we set up what's feeding each input in the mixer and where those mixer outputs are feeding as well. You can see that in each case I have 1 channel coming into input A, and we can actually have a second input active as well. I don't have those routed to any of the hardware outputs because we're feeding them through the main outs and they're also going straight into the DAW, but they are feeding into our headphones using the sends, which is the next layer, and that's down here. Now we can adjust these by individually grabbing them, sliding them back and forth, or if you select a row, you can use the faders at the bottom to set up a mix. And this is how I have independent mixes set up for Don and Nick. The top mix is feeding out to 1 set of headphones, and then I have the second mix down here, which is feeding a completely different mix into the other set of headphones. And then what I'm monitoring is what's coming out of the main outputs, feeding my monitors, as well as another headphone feed. So this is a very versatile system for setting up monitoring for your musicians as well as for yourself if you're serving as the engineer. It's flexible as far as being able to insert plugins, and again, there's no latency with any of that, whether you're using plugins or not. Let's lay down our basic tracks here. Nick is playing a Latin percussion cajon, and Don's playing a Fender P-Bass. So we'll switch over to Studio One and get our session rolling. So I have 3 tracks set up here. Each of those tracks is feeding from a separate input coming from the iOS. And again, that's feeding through that SoundGrid Studio. What we're actually monitoring is what's going through the SoundGrid Studio app. The recording is going straight to hard disk here. Now that we have our rhythm section tracks laid down, the cajon and the bass, we can add a nylon string guitar on top of that. But let's take a look at one other thing before we do that. We'll jump over to Studio One quickly and look at how plugins work there. So if we open up Studio One, we can see that we can add plugins. For example, we can put a, let's not do it here, let's put a reverb on the high cajon microphone, the front cajon microphone. So what I want to show you is that there's another app that comes with the DiGiGrid iOS. And that app is called Studio Rack. If we open that up, what this allows us to do is host wave plugins inside of Studio One, where they can run either using the native processing power of the computer, or we can use the processing power inside the chassis. Now the way it's set up here now, we have this switch set to local CPU. This means that any plugins that we add will be running inside the computer. So if we add a plugin here, anything from the list, it'll be using the computer's CPU power as it normally would be with the native plugin. But if we make a change here, if we change this to switch to SG, which stands for Studio Grid, SoundGrid, we'll be using the DSP power inside the DiGiGrid iOS. Now at this point, when we add a plugin, we're not actually doing anything inside the computer. That plugin is actually drawing power from inside the iOS box. So if we add a reverb here, we'll put TrueVerb on. Now this plugin running inside the Studio Rack is utilizing the DSP power from the DiGiGrid iOS, so we're not hitting our computer at all. And we can add up to 8 of those plugins in a row, so we can stack those all together without affecting our computer at all. Now this doesn't impact the way that the computer normally operates. I can add other plugins from other manufacturers, virtual instruments, VST instruments, in this case audio units will also work. All of those will still run inside the computer just as normal, but any of the Waves plugins that I've selected will be running inside the iOS box. Now we'll add our nylon string guitar overdub on top of our tracks. So we've got our 3 tracks recorded here, and I'm actually bringing those back into the SoundGrid Studio using channels 7 and 8. So I'm monitoring those here, again, so we can have latency-free monitoring with Don's Cordoba C-Dan guitar played through AEA and 8 microphones. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Waves DiGiGrid iOS audio interface and DSP server. It's a very powerful device that gives you great sounding I/O, excellent microphone preamps, and all that DSP power for running Waves plugins. It's an excellent addition to your studio, and again, it's expandable, so you can add on to it as your needs grow or you want to change your input and output connectivity. Thanks for joining me for Sweetwater Sound Check. I'm Mitch Gallagher.